Hi, my name is John Majarzik, and tonight I'm going to be talking about the relation of aerial spirits to the 1665 edition of the Discovery of Witchcraft, especially to these two documents that were added to the 1665 Discovery of Witchcraft, one of which is the treatise on the nature of elemental spirits, ghosts, and demons, the other of which consists of 9 chapters of rituals and ritual material. These documents form the focus of the series of 3 books that I've just released called The Magicians Discovered. Volume 1 of The Magicians Discovered is my own analysis of the material. Volume 2 contains the material, while Volume 3 contains texts contemporary to the material that I feel shed light on it and provide some context. Now, before getting into the relation of aerial spirits to the discovery material, let me back up a little bit and talk about Reginald Scott's original Discovery of Witchcraft. Reginald Scott's Discovery of Witchcraft was published in 1584, and it was a skeptical look at the subject. Scott believed that there was a strict separation between the world of the supernatural and the world of humanity, and that the things that witches and ritual magicians were being accused of were impossible. He believed that in the case of witches, that in many cases they were being accused of witchcraft for reasons that had nothing to do with their actual acts. Instead, perhaps they were simply socially unpopular, or there was some other sort of personal reason why people were prosecuting them. Alternately, if someone actually believed that they were doing the things that were attributed to witches of the time, Scott believed that they could have been either mentally ill or in some other way deluding themselves, that they themselves could have believed that they were doing these things, but in reality it was all in their minds. As for ritual magic, Scott believed that it simply didn't work, and that if a person practiced ritual magic on their own behalf and claimed to get results from it, that they too were deluding themselves. But that if somebody was doing magic on behalf of someone else, especially if they were doing it for money, and they claimed to get results from it, that the results were either the product of outright fraud or of the magicians using some little-known law of nature, which, though obscure, would not be supernatural. This is the same type of thing that stage magicians make use of today. Scott believed that these latter individuals should be prosecuted, but they shouldn't be prosecuted for magic. They should be prosecuted for ripping people off. One of the motivations behind Scott publishing the Discovery of Witchcraft was to convince people not to put people on trial and execute them for practicing witchcraft and ritual magic. It's theorized that Scott may have seen one of the mass witch trials that happened in the area of England that he was from, and that consequently he was motivated to write the Discovery to prevent things like that from happening again. Now, the way that he went out to demonstrate his point was fairly unique for his time. What he did was to gather as much primary source material about the practices of witches and those of ritual magicians as he could, then divide it up by category, introduce the category, present the material, then criticize it, outlining all the ways that he believed the things that were just described could not work. He also had a running commentary on the material in the form of marginal notes. many of which are quite entertaining. Scott had a very good sense of humor about this. This approach was unique because at the time there was a belief that if you simply read magical rituals, that you could in some way activate them, that you could accidentally summon the demon that they were talking about, or in other ways attract an evil spirit to you. Scott, believing in the strict separation of the world of the supernatural from the world of humanity, believed that that was impossible. And he actually talks at length about his reasonings behind this in the Discovery. Now, the inclusion of all this material had the side effect that the book became popular with people who wanted to use it, in their own magical practice. And there certainly was enough of it. Scott included rituals for calling up spirits of the dead, for calling up demons and enclosing them in crystals, calling up fairies, and for doing things even more complicated, such as making a pact with someone who knows that they're about to die, saying that after death they'll come to the magician and serve them for a number of years, in exchange for which the magician will pay the person handsomely during the last years of their lives. It also included many formulas for amulets and talismans. These included numerous charms for healing both people and livestock, methods for finding out who a thief was, methods for returning stolen property, as well as the occasional curse. Now, the people that the Discovery tended to be popular with were people who operated more on the ground level. People who, though they may have had a basic education which allowed them to be literate, nevertheless lacked the higher education that would have instructed them in Latin. And in fact, Reginald Scott's book was the first book printed in English that contained this sort of ritual material. The category of people that used the Discovery also overlapped with that of the cunning people. Now, the word cunning people is used to denote practitioners of benefic or white magic on behalf of their communities, who practice a form of magic that is highly influenced by Christianity. And we know that the cunning people use the Discovery because Owen Davies, who has written a history of cunning people and their beliefs, has documented cases where these people were arrested for one reason or another, and investigators, in looking at their library, found copies of the Discovery. He has also documented extant examples of amulets and talismans whose formulas are unique to the Discovery and that aren't found in other grimoires. This popularity is what led to the book being reprinted in 1665. Although the book was reprinted several years before, that printing was basically altered nothing except the typography. The 1665 edition, on the other hand, included this treatise on elemental spirits, ghosts and demons, and the 9 ritual chapters, presumably to make the book even more attractive to people who wanted to use it. And these materials were not written from a skeptical perspective. In fact, the first page of the treatise states that one of the reasons that the magicians are including it is because they believe that Reginald Scott has mischaracterized what magicians believe and the things that they do. And so They are writing to set the record straight. And as for the contents of this material, it's extremely unique. Unlike books that would be published several centuries later, such as Francis Barrett's The Magus, these documents were not simply cut and paste jobs of material that was previously available. Instead, what they contain is a very unique synthesis of a lot of different elements. The writers draw from the contemporary Paracelsian philosophy of their day, from the medieval grimoire tradition, from Renaissance Hermeticism. They draw from Greek and Roman writers and their examples of ghosts and demons and elemental spirits. They also draw from contemporary folklore, including that of Scotland, Scandinavia, and Germany, in their examples about elemental spirits and ghosts. These include descriptions of Scottish fairy belief, including descriptions that would pop up 30 years later in Robert Kirk's work, The Secret Commonwealth of Elves, Fauns, and Fairies. On top of which, they also include names and ideas from John Dee and Edward Kelly's A True and Faithful Relation of What Passed for Many Years Between Dr. John Dee and Some Spirits, which was published by Marie Casaubon in 1659, which was 6 years before the 1665 discovery. This book, which is a record of John Dee and Edward Kelly's communications with angels, forms one of the key parts of the system of Enochian magic that's used today. On top of all of this, the ritual material that was included has sections in it that appear to be drawn from pagan belief. It also heavily deals with aerial spirits. The ritual material includes 7 rituals. Of those 7 rituals, 4 of them deal with aerial spirits. 1 deals with summoning the personal genius into the crystal, while the last 2 deal with necromancy, with calling up spirits of the dead. Now, of those 4 rituals that deal with aerial spirits, 1 is a generic ritual for summoning aerial spirits. 3 are rituals for summoning particular aerial spirits. And it's those 3 rituals that also contain the pagan material. Now, before getting into what the relationship of aerial spirits was to this material, let me talk a little bit about the nature of these aerial spirits themselves. Now, by aerial spirits, I don't mean air elementals or spirits who represent the element of air. Instead, these are spirits who live in the air. They are spirits of the air. And in fact, the notion of an elemental spirit is something that was only produced in the late Renaissance. It was a series of categories that was imposed upon a diversity of nature spirits. The aerial spirits, on the other hand, were thought to play a very essential role in the cosmos. They were thought to be the bearers and intermediaries of planetary influence. They were thought to bear the influence of the planets to particular places in the world. Although they weren't planetary spirits, they were thought to correspond to the planet, so that you had martial aerial spirits, jovial aerial spirits, saturnine aerial spirits, etc. And they were thought as such to be kind of the connecting tissue between the world of the planets and the world of Earth. As such, They are also thought to be the bearers of the will of God as it manifested itself through astrology. Now, this notion of astrology as being a vehicle of the will of God might appear to be foreign to people who study astrology today. After all, we all know that the planets follow a regular orbit with periodical retrogrades that are also very predictable, and they have for millions of years. On the other hand, when people talk about the will of God, it's usually something very contemporary. It's in reference to something that's happening now, right? But let me back up and describe the cosmos as it was thought to exist in the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. So in that, at the very top you had God or divinity, under which you had 9 choirs of angels, under which you had the planetary realm, under which you had the aerial spirits, and then the earth. And the will of God was thought to be transmitted down the line, so to speak, from God to the angels, to the planetary forces, and then to the aerial spirits, and to the earth. On a personal level, consider this. Even though we all know that, even though the planets do their thing, the planets have their regular orbits, most of the individuals who follow astrology do not let it dictate every single decision in their lives. Most of the people who follow astrology, even though they may do so very seriously, nevertheless do not take advantage of all of the potentials that the astrology gives you, and they don't avoid all the pitfalls that astrology provides. Instead, they, like everyone else, live their lives. You live your life, you plan your life, you execute your life. And as you're living your life, the planets intersect with it. And the planets intersect with it in ways that to you appear to be unpredictable. Now, this can be seen in the phenomenon of the Mercury retrogrades, a phenomenon which people have argued has recently been overplayed, but nevertheless is real. If during a Mercury retrograde, you're working on a document that's very important on your computer, and suddenly your computer totally crashes and the information is irretrievable, this can seriously impact your life. And the notion that it was a product of a regular astrological phenomenon might not be that comforting. Now, to take it up a level, think about the idea of synchronicities. Recently, one of the ways that people have argued that astrology manifests in people's lives is through synchronicities, through meaningful coincidences. And in general, the idea of synchronicity is something that has been widely accepted in the occult and metaphysical community. Synchronicities, when they happen, are often thought to be examples of communication from the spirit world, from the divine, in whatever way it's conceptualized, to the individual. Information can be conveyed. Also, luck can be conveyed. You can have a synchronicity that benefits you, which manifests as unusually good luck. You can have a synchronicity that hurts you, that manifests as unusually bad luck. Now, Step back about several hundred years into the world of the Middle Ages. If somebody was experiencing synchronicities back then, it's more than likely that they would interpret them as being a communication from God. The information that might be revealed by a synchronicity wouldn't simply be from a generic spirit world or divine mind out there. It would be from God. Likewise, luck, positive luck, manifesting in a synchronicity would be experienced as the blessing of God, while bad luck experienced as a synchronicity would manifest itself as a punishment from God. Right? Now, step up one level from that of the individual to that of cities and countries. If a synchronicity happened, such as a certain astrological configuration that was followed by a disastrous war, it's possible that the people of the time would have interpreted that not simply as being caused by astrology, but that God himself was using astrology as a vehicle for showing his displeasure with the people. And in fact, up until the middle of the 17th century, we actually find examples of people saying this. In the middle of the 17th century, England had its civil war, which was largely a religious war between Catholics and Protestants, and astrologers who were analyzing what was happening said things like that because of a particular astrological configuration that had been followed by certain events, God was sending his displeasure and punishing his displeasure with the English people from their impiety and punishing them. Now, aerial spirits were thought to be the ones that were the bearers of this influence. And, for example, there's a document that's appended to the 6th and 7th books of Moses called Semiporos and Shemhamphorash, where the writer explicitly states that through Mars, God sends war, through Saturn, God sends pestilence and famine, through Jupiter, he sends abundance, and through Venus, he sends happiness. Now, if you're a magician and you were able to make use of these entities, you could theoretically get some of the powers that were attached to God. You could in some way replicate them, which is a very attractive proposition. But why exactly would that be necessary at all? I mean, these are planetary forces. The planets are up there. Why not simply deal with the planetary forces themselves instead of this other class of spirits? Well, there is a very good reason for that. Which was that there was a strongly held belief from the Middle Ages up until the middle of the Renaissance that the planetary spheres were ruled by angels, and you could not compel an angel to appear to you. You could ask the angel to come down, you could ask them to help you, you could ask them to appear, but you couldn't force them to do anything. It was their own choice. It was the same thing with saints, in that you can ask a saint to intercede for you, but the saint was in no way obligated to do so. Now, this didn't mean that individuals couldn't make use of planetary forces in a more passive way through the use of sympathy and antipathy. But that was different from being able to actually call up an entity that corresponded to the planetary forces. There is no such problem with the aerial spirits. You could call them, you could evoke them, you could conjure them, treat with them, and if you were particularly nasty, you could punish them and force them to do things. And you could do this because they weren't angels, but they were demons. Albeit demons who had a very unusual role in the cosmos, in that they were also considered to be the bearers of God's will. Now, this contradiction happened because of the difficulty of Christian authors in fitting these spirits into their view of the cosmos. The aerial spirits were pre-existing pagan spirits. And in fact, St. Paul mentions them in the New Testament. He has a very famous line where he talks about the necessity of struggling against principalities, powers, and world rulers. Now, biblical scholars are almost universally united in saying that Paul wasn't referring to actual princes, actual powers, actual world rulers, but what he was referring to was the genus loci of various nations. And what he was saying was that these genus loci, who he felt were demonic, were now being put on notice that because Jesus had come, their influence was going to be overthrown. On the other hand, the people who formulated the Christian worldview also drew on the thought of the late Neoplatonists, either directly or through writers such as the Pseudo-Dionysius. And these authors had a much more positive view of the aerial spirits. They thought that they were lesser daemones, and that they too were messengers between the higher realms and the earth. Consequently, this tension and this sort of inability to really figure out where these entities lay, led to the paradoxical situation that I've just outlined. And a similar thing could be said about the spirits who would later be called elementals. These spirits who were spirits of rivers, spirits of wells, of forests, of trees, volcanoes, mountains, caves, on the one hand, were part of pagan religion. They were venerated, and so they had to be bad. On the other hand, the accounts of them that were given by classical writers such as Pliny and Ovid didn't portray them as being particularly malicious. And in fact, one of the Christian writers sort of between the Middle Ages and the Renaissance said of them that although they were demons that only caused annoyances for people, as opposed to more malicious demons such as Beelzebub, who were thought to cause serious damage both on the personal level and in the world at large. This contradiction and ambiguity would ultimately lead to the creation of the category of elemental spirit as this kind of neutral category between that of angel and demon. However, in the Middle Ages, there was no such option. And it was during the Middle Ages that the tradition of summoning aerial spirits was established. The Sworn Book of Honorius, which is one of the first major grimoires dealing with them, was written in the 14th century. And the tradition was carried on from them into grimoires such as the Heptameron, which is a product of the Renaissance, which was included with Pseudo-Agrippa's fourth book. It was carried on into Johannes Trithemius's Steganographia, and also into the Theurgia Goetia, which should be distinguished from the Ars Goetia, which is usually what people think of when you say Goetia. The Theurgia Goetia dealt with summoning aerial spirits, only in this case it didn't organize them primarily according to the planets, but according to the different directions. And in fact, in the front of the Theurgia Goetia, there is a very nice compass rose diagram that's drawn that illustrates the directions, the subdirections, and the sub-subdirections of the world, and that gives the attributions of the aerial spirits to them. Now, how all this relates to the 1665 Discovery of Witchcraft. Well, to illustrate that, let me look at the first major ritual that's included. Like I said, of the 7 rituals that are included, 4 have to do with aerial spirits, one of which was a ritual for generically calling aerial spirits, the other 3 of which deal with summoning particular aerial spirits. Now, this ritual deals with summoning spirits of the wild hunt. These are the 3 great hunters of the north from the kingdom of Fiachim, or Fiachim. When summoned, they come into the circle, preceded by servants on horseback, blowing horns, as well as a pack of hunting dogs. And the powers that they can grant to the magician and the things that they can do for them are things that are usually attributed to aerial spirits, such as the ability to tell them about any region and what's going on there, anywhere in the globe, especially, they say, about places on the globe that are little known. They can also make the person invisible. They can cause the person to fly through the air. And they can also go to the treasury of any king or emperor anywhere in the world and bring the magician their jewels and gold. With this, basically what I think happened was the following. The wild hunt was originally a pagan phenomenon. It was led by Odin. It was a procession of the dead through the atmosphere. After paganism was outlawed, in many places the figure of Odin was replaced by any number of lesser spirits, and the phenomenon was also demonized. As part of the old religion, these forces were seen as being demonic. Sometime later, a magician, seeing this phenomenon and seeing that it was labeled as demonic, decided that this would be a good candidate to summon up. Because after all, if these forces were demons, then perhaps they could do something for the magician, just like other demons from grimoires were described as being able to do. Right? Then sometime later, they were integrated into the notion of aerial spirits. And we know that this happened because the author uses parts of the Heptameron in the ritual. He uses names from the Heptameron in the construction of the circle. He also uses names from the Heptameron in the construction of a special girdle that the magician is supposed to wear in order to protect them. As for the magical circle, the names used in it are derived from the day of Friday in the Heptameron that corresponds to Venus. And they even include instructions to make a certain sigil that corresponds to Venus that's mostly only found in the Heptameron. When it comes to making the girdle of protection, The magician is instructed to use names from the Heptameron's day of Tuesday and Thursday. That is from the days of Mars and Jupiter, which are useful planets if you are going to try to protect yourself. What I think happened here is that there was a pre-existing ritual. Somebody became aware of the Heptameron, looked at the spirits that it was supposed to deal with, and decided that they were talking about the same thing, that the Heptameron spirits were identical with the spirits that were described in this ritual. And if that was the case, then why not use elements of the Heptameron to try to call them up? Wouldn't that make it more effective? Similarly, more information about the nature of these spirits, including how they relate to the tradition of aerial spirits, can be gotten through looking at the names that are given to the three hunters. These are Paimon, Bothan, and Barma. Paimon is a spirit from the Ars Goetia, from the Lemegeton, who's also found in numerous other grimoires where he appears as a demon king of the West. Bothan is a spirit from the Ars Goetia, from the Lemegeton, who possesses the power of being able to transport someone any place in the world in the blink of an eye, while Barma is actually drawn from a true and faithful relation. He appears in D.N. Kelly's Angel manuscripts, where he actually gets a somewhat substantial mention. In a true and faithful relation, Barma is described as a demon who possesses Edward Kelly. And after he is cast out of Edward Kelly, he's described as wearing a cap, having a satchel on its side, and being followed by a train of 14 demons who are made up of dogs, monkeys, and monstrous men. Now, this description is a description of a hunter. He has his hunting cap on, he has his satchel with his hunting supplies, and the 14 demons who are behind him are his hunting dogs, right? And so someone who had possession of this ritual also read a true and faithful relation and probably thought to themselves that the spirit that was being described there was the same as one of the spirits that appeared in the ritual. And if that was the case, why not incorporate his name into it? Which they did. There are other names incorporated into the ritual from a true and faithful relation, especially the place where the spirits are said to come from, which is the kingdom of Fiachim or Fiachim. Fiachim only appears in a true and faithful relation. It is a fictional kingdom that exists below the North Pole, which is described to D.N. Kelly in the section where the geographical correspondences of the aerial governors are given. These are the 91 aerial governors who are the governors of the airs, or aethers. Only here, what they govern isn't the aethers, but particular places, right? And these aerial governors are actually the aerial spirits. They're the same spirits we've been talking about. And the angels and Dee and Kelly make this clear in several places in A True and Faithful Relation. In one section of the book, the angels describe the aerial spirits not as angels, but as spirits who are not condemned, but are dignified and set in a particular place for a time. This was something that the editor of A True and Faithful Relation, Marie Casaubon, seized on and inserted a marginal note directing his readers to look at, because he was familiar with the tradition, and this was evidence that Dee and Kelly weren't dealing with angels, but were dealing with demons, which in this case was somewhat correct. Now, the aerial governors, besides corresponding to the Aethers, were thought to correspond to many different places around the globe. They were thought to correspond to places that Dee and Kelly were familiar with, such as Europe and parts of the Near East, but they were also thought to correspond to places in Africa, places in India, places in the New World, and places in Asia. They were also thought to correspond to places that were either mythological or semi-mythological, but that people in the 16th century probably believed existed. An aerial governor is given for the Garden of Eden, for example. Another aerial governor is given to the place where Noah's Ark has come to rest, with the description being that Noah's Ark is still there. And an aerial governor is given to the kingdom of Fiachim. Now, Jacob Grimm, in his Teutonic mythology, when he interviewed informants about the wild hunts and asked them where exactly they thought it came from, they tended to indicate that it came from some mountain somewhere that was either anonymous or was something that was kind of on the periphery of their consciousness and awareness of the geography of the world, right? The interesting thing about Fiachim and the pole is that during the time that Dee and Kelly were having their angel transcripts, as well as a little bit after, it was thought that there was an extremely large mountain at the pole. And this was something believed by Dee himself, and that also popped up in maps of the time, such as that of Giraldus Mercator. So what I think happened was that someone had possession of this ritual, who was also aware of the legend, who also was reading A True and Faithful Relation, and thought that Fiachim was perhaps a name that referred to the place where the wild hunt was from. And that because it was being given by angels, that it therefore would be much more accurate than any other name that people had. And so they decided to incorporate it into it. I should say also that of the other two rituals that contain pagan information, both of them refer to their spirits, who are thunder spirits, as living in the mountains of northern Norway. And in this, I take the geographical attribution of them to Norway, not necessarily to mean that the writers actually thought that they lived there, so much as taking it as kind of an expression, like they lived at the farthest corners of the world or someplace really far up north. They lived in the lived in the northern mountains of Norway, right? In which case, I believe that the authors thought that these spirits basically lived at the same source as the spirits of the Wild Hunt. It was just like a different way of describing the same thing. So, in all of this, you can see how this tradition gradually builds on itself. You start with something that's pagan, it gets demonized. As a demonic phenomenon, it becomes incorporated into black magic as something to summon and use. Sometime later, someone comes across the Heptameron, decides that it's talking about the same sorts of spirits that are contained in the ritual, decides to incorporate parts of the Heptameron into the ritual. Then later, again, somebody with a ritual is reading a true and faithful relation and decides that the spirit Barma that's being described, as well as the kingdom of Fiachim, are places that is a person and a place that's being described in the ritual already, and so decide to incorporate it into it. All producing the ritual that we see today. I think that it demonstrates a pretty constant movement of trying to understand where exactly these spirits fit in to the world based on, with alterations being made based on getting new information and having new information in the form of these books be accessible. So that even though the final product might appear to be obscure, nonetheless there are very clear motivations and concepts behind it. So that's all I have now. I'd be willing to open it up for questions.